I'm Liam Milan, and in this video we're going to look at Ableton Live's echo and delay devices. So let's load them up first. Echo is here, and delay we have here too. So if you're not aware, basically echoes or delays are basically discernible repeats of a sound. So reverb's different. Reverb is trying to create the reaction of a room which has millions of tiny reflections happening in a small cluster of time, and we can't discern them as individual repeats, whereas an echo is rhythmic. We can hear the repeats after the original event, we can hear the repeats afterwards. Now the flavour of those repeats, the time that they take to last, or the speed that they run at, they're all variable. We can do that within both of these devices. But that's the main nature of it, is discernible repeats. So if you have a look at both echo and delay, you can see there's some similarity between the two. And we'll move to delay to begin with, and then we'll look at more of the advanced features which are within echo. So we have the timing of the actual delay itself. It's slightly different in its look, but we can have it synchronized, or we can have it set to milliseconds, so we can have it so it's not set to be completely mechanical and on the grid. We have variables of the actual timing itself when we're in sync, and again, if we're out of sync mode, that's in milliseconds as we change it. Then we have this binding control here, which basically links the left and the right channels. So with those enabled, you notice as I change one side, the other one follows it. It follows suit because those are both bound. If you want to independently have a delay lines at a certain speed on the left and a different speed on the right, you can unlink those and change them. And something that you have here that's common between the two is the percent control, which allows us to basically take what could be a rigid eighth speed of an eighth of a bar, and then set the percentage to either be positive or negative, to either push ahead of that time or behind, but in small increments. So it offsets it from being absolutely perfect and on the grid. We have a feedback control, which basically feeds the delay back in on itself and means that it will last longer. High feedback amounts can get to the point where it will last forever. It will go infinite. And then what we also have is a freeze control, which allows us to grab the echoes and just hold them as they are. But I'll explain those in a moment. The other aspects that are common between the two is our kind of expected dry-wet control. If we're dropping this onto an actual track, using it as what we call an insert processor, we want to have the original sound, in most cases, we want to have the original sound heard along the echo repeats as well. However, if you're dragging these to a return track, where the original sound still plays from the track and you feed a copy to that delay, you'll want to make sure that the delay itself is set to fully wet. So there's a combination of the source sound on the track that the sound came from, and then the delayed version will be on the return track fully wet. So just watch out for that if you're using these on return tracks. We're going to use these as inserts though. We're going to play around with them on some specific sounds within our mix. So we have a percussive sound here. I'll play the whole musical thing in context, and then I'll single out this sound. So quite a tribally kind of 4/4 beat there. And here's a layer that's within there. So I'll just turn it up so we can hear it when it's in solo a bit easier. Okay, so quite a simple rhythm that's playing there. As we increase the dry wet, I'll then walk you through the controls of delay. Okay, so we can hear the speed that's running right now. Let's change that until we find something that seems to complement the existing rhythm. Now, normally with echo, you don't want to necessarily enforce the rhythm that's already in place. You want to add rhythms that can land in between that existing rhythm. So I'm just going to experiment with the different times and find something that complements this. Okay, that sounds quite nice. Now you notice as I switch the settings, you actually had this like gliding pitch change that's happening. Now that's what this setting's about. We have repitch, which emulates the behavior when we used to use tape machines to create echoes. So we get this kind of warbled pitch change as we switch the kind of speed that tape's running at to get different echo speeds. And it's quite desirable. It's especially quite creative in terms of being able to use it as an ability to have sort of nice musical events happening, or events of interest in there. So we could always automate that, show automation, and have that as a sort of a flourish within what we're doing, switch it at different points in the song and have these kind of gliding pitch changes being part of the echo. If you go to fade mode, it sounds quite different. It fades between the two different changes in speed. And then jump is a literal change immediate between the two. So as you can hear, fade and jump, not so obvious between the two. It's a bit more of a finer detail, but repitch is a significantly different behavior between this. So let's have a look at the ability to change the percentage of this timing and see if we can get it a bit more of a groove. Let's go a little bit more off the grid. So I started with the left one being at 6.2%, which changed the timing slightly. And you notice immediately the stereo image changed too, because I hadn't altered the right-hand side. So I want to keep that stereo image uniform. I can put them both to the same percentage and have them both offset by the same amount. Or I can play around with the left and the right settings to get a bit more of a movement between the left and right speaker. So that feedback amount there is literally how long this will last for. If I set it to the minimum amount, we'll just get one repeat. Just immediately after the first repeat, it stops again. So I need to find how I find that or feel that that works well within this source sound. Okay, so let's have a look at the next stage of this. We have a filtering system for the echoes. So at the moment, the filter is enabled. We can turn that on and off, but the filter is slightly removing the very lowest of the sound and the very highest of the sound, but it's so slight we can't really hear it. What we can do is choose to actually tune the content. So not as in change the pitch of it, but just change which portion of it can be heard. So if we actually narrow the width of the filter, and I'll do this while it's playing, you'll be able to hear when I narrow it, that you have a way less dominant echo. So you can kind of get away with having it louder because it's not taking up so much of the mix. And then I'm going to change the actual position of this filter to whether it's going to only let through lower frequencies or higher frequencies. Now, there's no set rule for this. Personally, what I tend to do when I'm designing the sounds to go into my songs is I'll design the source sound to fit, in a complementary way with the other instrumentation. But then when I want to give it a sense of space, if I use a delay, I'll then sweep the actual filter and find a pocket of space within my mix and then allow the delays to live in there. So the source sound and the delays don't compete with other aspects of my mix. So let's just put this in context of the full song now. Now, if you remember, that was quite loud just so we could hear it. So I'll turn it back down, I'll bring it in, and then I'll just tune this filter to get it to sit into the mix. Okay, so it was obviously very loud when we worked on it, and that's a good idea, so you can hear the obvious subtleties and changes that you do, but eventually you've got to listen to it in context of everything else and then usually back off from how severe the effect is and set it to work well with its neighboring sound sources. So we've talked about repitch, fade and jump, the filter section, the timing, and a lot of these are shared with the Echo device as well. The last thing to cover, or the last two things to cover on this device before we move over to Echo, is the ping pong effect, where it won't do a uniform echo through the left and right speakers. It will walk them between the left and right speakers, so it gives you a much more kind of movement in the stereo field. So listen to that while we solo this out, and you'll hear the difference in ping pong mode. So it's much more severe than that percentage amount we put on the timing, because it's panning those echoes from the left to the right as they walk through their speed that they're running at. So the final thing I wanted to mention on delay is the modulation aspect here. So what we have here is a rate of modulation. So we have a moving up and down motion. and we can choose how fast that is. That's what the rate controls. Now the motion of that rate can be attached to something. So we have the option here to change it to attach to the filter position. So that filter can start moving sympathetically with the rate, the speed that the actual modulation is happening at, or we can have the time be modulated as well. Now with repitch mode enabled, that can be quite creative. So like hitting the different speed settings on the Echo, we'll hear those gliding sound changes. So I'm just going to do it to the filter, and we'll do it in solo mode, and just set it to fully wet so you can hear that quite obviously. So at the moment the filter's fixed, it's not modulated. Okay, now let's put the most amount of modulation to that filter, and you'll hear that the rate affects how fast the filter changes its current position to above and below its current position. So it's good practice. It's apply quite severely, get the timing right on the rate, and then back off the amount of modulation and make it sit a bit more subtly so you have some subtle motion. So the same thing with the time. So really that repitch is the main thing that's going to make that kind of gliding aspect happen when you modulate the time control. So let's just sit that back in. I like the ping pong effect, so I'm going to leave that on there. Okay, now let's have a look at Echo. So I have a starting point with another sound that's just going to run around on a loop. So turn it up a little bit. To a slightly distorted synthetic stab. And let's get Echo on there. So in a similar aspect, we have the timing options here. We do have an input dial on here, which is slightly different. So we can change the level going into the device, and we can also enable distortion process that happens on the input before it goes through to the Echo aspect of the device too. So if I turn on distortion and start increasing the input gain, we'll start hearing that the characteristic of the sound changes in the actual Echo part of the device. Now that's obviously very loud, so I'm just going to pull the output down of the device there. Don't want the echoes to last so long, so let's pull that feedback back there. Okay, so we have a filter here. We can't see it by default, but we can open that up and we'll see the same kind of band pass filter. This one works slightly differently, as in it's got a beginning and an end point to that band pass. So we have a low and a high point. So we can kind of dial that in to be the frequencies that we want. So Echo has a lot more in it in terms of how we can shape a sound. So we have a reverb section in here, which is very simple, but like the distortion stage on here, it's handy to have it all in one device and not have to think about grabbing a distortion unit and grabbing a reverb unit. You can kind of just play with it within the device itself. So the reverb basically has a balance amount here. We have a decay, so the length of the actual reverb itself, and then we have a choice of where it is actually positioned in the audio routing within the device. So pre will be before the actual echoes. So the echoes will be a repeat of the reverberated version of the sound. Then we have post, where the echoes will happen and then a reverberation is added afterwards, often useful to soften the effect of the rhythm of the echo. And then we have a feedback option as well, where the feedback is obviously how long it lasts, but it happens, as I mentioned earlier, by feeding the signal back in on itself, so it repeats more and more over time. We can kind of soften those repeats as they increase, and the reverb can help out there as well. So I'm just going to play around with this and get a sound that I like. Okay, now with the feedback, when you go over 100%, you're basically going to have something that keeps increasing even when you stop the playback of it. It's kind of self-propelling at that point. So it's a good idea if you're going to play around with high feedbacks is to start automating it. So at the end of an idea, you can kind of back it off and not have it last for too long if you don't want it to anyway, keep it under control. So the stereo aspect, the ping pong, we've already covered in the delay device. Mid and side slightly different. So the mid and side echo is based around the signal that runs uniformly through the left and right speakers, the shared information that will hit in unison between the left and right signals. And then the side signal is slightly different. The side is the difference, the stuff that isn't uniform through the left and right speaker, and that's generally our sense of space. So when we use the mid and side echo, it creates a really interesting kind of stereo depth because it's dealing with the very mono aspect of our signal separately from the side signal as well. So let's just try those and see which one kind of suits this context. Okay, I like the ping pong, but let's try and reduce the stereo using the width control here. Okay, so this is fully wet, so let's try and balance that dry wet. Very loud again, so let's just pull down the dry to fit in context of the mix, and then I'll bring in the effect afterwards. Okay, so modulation, very similar to what we had before, but slightly more detailed in terms of how we can use it. We have a synchronized rate in this case, so we can synchronize it to the BPM of the song. We have a phase of modulation, so the left channel can be modulated at a different time than the right, so we can create even more stereo effects there. And we can choose what it is that it's actually modulating, so the delay time and then the filter position, just as it was before. And then character is an area where we can actually kind of treat the signal before it goes into the actual echo device. So we have a gate, which in context we could use to basically only allow the loudest part of a signal through to the echoes. So it only echoes a snippet of the sound. And then in the dry version of the sound, it'll still play through. So let's try that. You hear there's only a tiny fraction of that sample coming through. So the sound is a longer stab, but it's only a little dip part of it getting through to the echo. So the echo becomes much more sort of detailed and rhythmic as it goes through. We have the ducking effect here, which is the same as setting up again more gear to be able to push back the delays when the dry sound plays, and then the level of the delays can come back to what level you set them to when the dry sound has stopped playing. So if we turn on the ducking effect here, should be able to hear now that the dry signal is actually louder than the echo, but once the dry signal stops playing and there's that rest, the echoes return back and swell back to their normal volume. So again, it can be done with devices outside, but it's a useful one for having to hand within the device. I'm just playing with a noise dial here, which is basically just adds a little bit of character to what we're doing here in terms of adding some noise into the effect. And then we have the wobble amount as well. So as you can hear, it's generally just creating kind of like a repitch effect, slightly different in terms of it creating this kind of wave of pitch changing over time. So that's it with those two devices. If you're new to this, start off with delay before you get into echo, because it does have a lot less features to get your head around. But between the two of them, you can use them to either do sound design and maybe go for a very wet signal, especially with echo, play around with the distortion, play around with the actual feedback amounts and the modulation. Or you can just set them where they're very heavy in terms of how wet they are, and then back off to a much sort of drier balance of the signal once you've tuned in the sound and get it to work within the context of your mix.